The wind howled through the splintered floorboards of the Bitter Creek saloon, but the room went dead silent the moment Silas Hatcher kicked the swinging doors open. He was a man carved from the jagged granite of the Wind River Range, a towering silhouette smelling of pine smoke, dried blood, and sheer desperation. Striding to the mahogany bar, he slammed a heavy leather pouch of raw gold dust onto the wood. "I need a wife by tomorrow morning," his voice rumbled, rough as unpolished stone. "Any woman willing will never want for coin again." From the shadows of the darkest corner, a bruised and desperate woman stepped forward. She didn't look at his gold. Instead, she leaned close and whispered one chilling question. The year was 1882, and the Wyoming Territory was an unforgiving anvil where people were either forged into iron or hammered into dust. Bitter Creek was a town that specialized in the latter. It was a miserable collection of canvas tents and rough-hewn timber buildings clinging to the edge of a dying silver vein. Abigail Preston had been hammered into dust. 6 months ago, her father, Thomas Preston, had coughed his last breath into a blood-stained rag, leaving Abigail with nothing but a worthless deed to a dry claim and a mountain of debt. The debt was held by Ezekiel Cobb, a ruthless land baron who owned the local bank, the assayer's office, and the sheriff. Cobb didn't want the silver claim. He wanted Abigail. He had made it abundantly clear that her father's ledgers would be forgiven the moment she agreed to warm his bed at the sprawling ranch house just outside of town. Abigail had spent the last 3 weeks scrubbing floors at Martha Higgins' boarding house, sleeping in the root cellar, and keeping a loaded derringer tucked into her corset. But time had run out. That afternoon, Cobb's lead enforcer, a scarred brute named Wyatt, had paid her a visit. He broke 2 of her ribs with a casual backhand and promised he would return at midnight to drag her to Cobb's estate by her hair. It was 10 o'clock at night. The saloon attached to the boarding house was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Abigail sat in the corner, pressing a cold, damp rag to her swelling cheek, calculating how many miles she could make on foot into the brutal wilderness before Wyatt caught her. The answer was none. She was a dead woman walking, or worse, a prisoner to a monster. Then, the saloon doors violently slammed open. The man who filled the frame was a giant, dressed in buckskins darkened by years of grease and weather. A heavy buffalo hide coat draped over his broad shoulders, and a Winchester rifle was held loosely, but dangerously, in his massive right hand. This was Silas Hatcher. Silas was a ghost to the townspeople, a mountain man who lived high up in the treacherous peaks of the Wind River Range. He only came down to Bitter Creek once a year to trade furs for coffee, flour, and black powder. He was known to be solitary, savage, and entirely unbothered by the civilized world. But tonight, the civilized world was exactly what he needed. Silas marched to the bar, the heavy thud of his boots silencing the drunken chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the tinny plinking of the out-of-tune piano. He didn't order a drink. He unhooked a heavy leather pouch from his belt and let it drop onto the bar with a sound that made every greedy eye in the room widen. "I need a wife by tomorrow morning," Silas announced, his voice carrying easily over the stunned silence. The bartender, a sweaty man named O'Malley, swallowed hard. A wife, Silas? You've been up in the high country too long. The girls upstairs charge by the hour, not the lifetime. I ain't looking for a parlor girl," Silas growled, his icy blue eyes scanning the room, daring any man to laugh. "I need a legal, binding marriage signed by a preacher and registered at the territory office by dawn. My grandfather, old Jedediah Hatcher, left a clause in his will. The deed to the Upper Valley, 3,000 acres of prime timber and water rights transfers to the state tomorrow at noon if I ain't wed. The government sent a surveyor up last week to serve me the papers. They want that land for the new railroad spur." Silas tapped the heavy pouch. "There's $500 in gold dust in this bag. The woman who stands before the preacher with me tonight gets it all, and she gets the protection of my name." Laughter erupted from a table of roughnecks, quickly silenced when Silas leveled a stare that promised sudden death. The women in the room, mostly saloon girls and exhausted wives of miners, stayed rooted to their spots. To go up into the Wind River Mountains with a wild man, miles away from another living soul, to live in the brutal, freezing isolation of a trapper's cabin, it was a death sentence, except to someone who was already dead. Abigail let the damp rag fall from her face. She looked at the giant of a man. She looked at the gold. Then, she looked at the grandfather clock ticking relentlessly toward midnight. Wyatt was coming. Cobb was waiting. She stood up. Her ribs screamed in agony, but she forced herself to walk across the sticky floorboards, the eyes of the entire saloon burning into her back. She stopped 2 feet from Silas. Up close, he was even more intimidating. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow. He looked down at her, taking in her ragged dress, her bruised cheek, and her frail, trembling frame. "You?" Silas asked, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. "You wouldn't last a week in the winter snows, little bird." "I don't need to survive the winter," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady. "I only need to survive tonight." She didn't reach for the gold. Instead, she stepped directly into his personal space, grabbed the rough lapels of his buffalo coat, pulled him down slightly, and whispered her one question into his ear. "Will you kill the man hunting me?" Silas Hatcher stiffened. The scent of her lye soap and terrified sweat filled his nose. He pulled back slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. He saw the deep, purpling bruise on her cheekbone and the terrifying clarity in her hazel eyes. This wasn't a woman looking for easy money. This was a cornered animal making a final, desperate play for survival. "Who?" Silas asked, his voice a low, rumbling octave meant only for her. "Ezekiel Cobb," Abigail whispered back. "And his man, Wyatt. They are coming for me at midnight. If I stay in this town, I am ruined. If I try to run alone, they will drag me back by my throat." She took a shallow, painful breath. "Marry me. Take me out of this valley. And if they follow, put them in the ground. You do that, and I will sign whatever paper you need to keep your mountain." Silas stared at her. Ezekiel Cobb was a dangerous name. He practically owned Bitter Creek, and his influence stretched all the way to the governor's office in Cheyenne. Picking a fight with Cobb meant declaring war on a small army of paid gunslingers and corrupt lawmen. But Silas thought of his grandfather's cabin. He thought of the pristine, untouched valley, the herd of elk that grazed by the alpine lake, and the whispering pines that held the only peace he had ever known. The railroad company wanted to blast it to rubble, lay iron tracks, and fill the air with coal smoke. "Cobb has 20 men on his payroll," Silas stated flatly. "Then you'll need more bullets," Abigail replied without missing a beat. A slow, unexpected smirk pulled at the corner of Silas's mouth beneath his thick beard. He respected grit, and this fragile, battered woman possessed a spine of solid steel. "O'Malley," Silas barked, turning back to the bartender. "Go wake up Reverend Josiah Smith. Drag him out of his bed by his nightshirt if you have to. Tell him there's $20 in it for him if he's here in 5 minutes with his Bible." The saloon erupted into a buzz of shocked whispers. O'Malley scrambled out from behind the bar and bolted out the swinging doors into the muddy street. Silas turned back to Abigail. "What's your name?" "Abigail Preston." "Well, Abigail Preston. Go pack whatever you own. We leave the second the ink is dry." "I own nothing," she said. "Only what I'm wearing," Silas frowned, shrugging off his heavy buffalo hide coat. He draped it over her shoulders. The coat dwarfed her, the heavy leather and thick fur smelling powerfully of the wild, but it was immediately, overwhelmingly warm. "Keep it on. It drops below freezing halfway up the pass, even in autumn." Within 10 minutes, Reverend Josiah Smith, bleary-eyed and trembling, stood in the center of the saloon. He clutched his worn Bible, looking nervously between the mountain man and the bruised young woman. Silas," the Reverend stammered. "Are you certain of this? Marriage is a holy sacrament, not a business transaction." "Read the words, Josiah," Silas commanded, stepping next to Abigail. The ceremony was a bizarre, disjointed affair, underscored by the raucous noise of the saloon patrons who had formed a crude, mocking audience. Abigail didn't hear a word of the holy vows. Her ears were straining, listening to the howling wind outside, waiting for the heavy hoofbeats of Wyatt's horse. "Do you, Silas Hatcher, take this woman?" Tick, tick. The grandfather clock against the wall showed 11:45 p.m. "I do," Silas rumbled. "And do you, Abigail Preston, take this man?" Tick, tick. 11:48 p.m. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you man and wife." The Reverend quickly produced a crumpled marriage certificate from his coat pocket, smoothing it out on a whiskey-stained table. "Sign here. Both of you." Silas scrawled his name in jagged, forceful letters. Abigail took the pen, her hand shaking. As she signed Abigail Hatcher, the saloon doors burst open. The cold wind swept in, blowing the smoke into a frenzied swirl. Standing in the doorway was Wyatt. He was a broad, ugly man with a face like a crushed tin can, wearing a long duster and a silver star pinned to his chest, a deputy's badge bought and paid for by Ezekiel Cobb. 2 heavily armed men stood behind him. Wyatt's eyes scanned the room, landing instantly on Abigail. He smiled, a sickening display of rotted teeth. "Well now, Abby," Wyatt sneered, stepping into the saloon. His hand rested lazily on the butt of his Colt revolver. "Mr. Cobb sent me to fetch you. Seems you've got some debts to work off. Come on now, don't make me break the rest of your ribs." Abigail froze, the blood draining from her face. She shrank back instinctively, the heavy buffalo coat swallowing her trembling frame. Silas stepped in front of her, entirely blocking Wyatt's view. "The lady is spoken for," Silas said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. Wyatt stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in the massive mountain man. "Hatcher, this ain't your business. Step aside and go back to your furs. This girl belongs to Mr. Cobb." "This girl," Silas corrected, picking up the freshly signed marriage certificate and holding it up, "is my wife, and she doesn't belong to any man, but she resides under my protection." Wyatt laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at his two men, who chuckled on cue. "A piece of paper don't mean spit to a bullet, Hatcher. Cobb wants her. I'm taking her. Last warning." Wyatt's hand twitched toward his holster. He never even cleared leather. Silas moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that defied his massive size. He didn't draw his rifle. He stepped forward, grabbed Wyatt by the throat with his left hand, and lifted the man entirely off his feet. Wyatt choked, his hands clawing desperately at the iron grip crushing his windpipe. Before the two men behind Wyatt could react, Silas drew a massive Bowie knife from his belt in a flash of steel and pressed the razor-sharp edge against Wyatt's carotid artery. "You ride back to Ezekiel Cobb," Silas hissed, his face inches from Wyatt's turning purple face. "You tell him Abigail Hatcher's debts are paid in full. If he, or you, or any of his dogs ever step foot on my mountain, I won't use the flat of the blade. I'll skin you alive and leave you for the wolves. Nod if you understand." Wyatt, eyes bulging with pure terror, managed a frantic, jerky nod. Silas threw him backward. Wyatt crashed into his own men, all three of them sprawling into the muddy street outside. Silas didn't wait for them to recover. He turned to Abigail, holstered his knife, and grabbed her by the arm. "We ride, now." The journey up into the Wind River Range was a punishing descent into darkness and cold. Silas owned two horses, a massive, ill-tempered black draft horse named Goliath, and a smaller, sturdy roan mare loaded with his winter supplies. He hoisted Abigail onto Goliath's saddle, climbing up behind her. They rode hard for the first 3 hours. The only sounds, the rhythmic thud of hooves, the creaking of saddle leather, and the rushing waters of the river they followed upward. Abigail sat rigid in front of him, clenching the saddle horn. The pain in her broken ribs was a blinding, white-hot agony with every jolt of the horse, but she bit her lip until it bled, refusing to make a sound. She was acutely aware of the man behind her. Silas's broad chest shielded her from the biting northern wind, his arms bracketing her securely. He was a stranger, a killer, and now her husband. She had traded the certainty of a gilded cage with Ezekiel Cobb for the terrifying unknown of the wild with a man whose capacity for violence she had just witnessed firsthand. As the elevation climbed, the temperature plummeted. The muddy trail turned to frost, and the scattered pines thickened into a dense, suffocating forest. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy. "Are you still bleeding?" Silas asked suddenly, his voice startling her in the deep silence. I wasn't bleeding," she stammered, teeth chattering. "Just ribs. Your lip is bleeding," he corrected. "I can smell the copper. Don't swallow the pain, Abigail. If you need me to slow down, say so. If you pass out and fall off this horse, we lose time." "I won't fall," she said fiercely, "and we can't slow down. Wyatt will regroup. He'll come after us." "Wyatt won't track us in the dark," Silas said calmly. "He's a town dog. Town dogs don't like the deep woods at night. They'll wait till first light. By then, we'll be through the Devil's Gate." "The Devil's Gate?" "A narrow pass," Silas explained. "It's the only way into the upper valley. I can hold it against 20 men with a single rifle. Once we're through, we're safe." They rode for another grueling hour before Silas finally called a halt. They were at the base of a massive rock formation, a sheer cliff face that seemed to rise directly into the starry sky. A narrow fissure, no wider than 2 horses abreast, cut through the stone. "We camp here for a few hours," Silas announced, sliding off the horse. He reached up and easily lifted Abigail down. Her legs gave out the moment her boots hit the frozen dirt. She collapsed, gasping as her ribs screamed. Silas caught her before she hit the ground. He carried her to the base of a massive pine tree, setting her down gently. Without a word, he set to work. Within minutes, he had the horses tied, a small, smokeless fire built from dry twigs, and a tin cup of strong, bitter coffee pressed into her shivering hands. "Drink," he ordered. Abigail drank. The heat spread through her chest, chasing away a fraction of the deep cold. She watched Silas as he crouched by the fire, sharpening his Bowie knife with a whetstone. The firelight danced over his scarred face, highlighting the hard, unforgiving lines of his jaw. "Why didn't you just pay the government?" Abigail asked softly. "You had $500 in gold. You could have bought the land outright instead of marrying a stranger." Silas didn't look up from his blade. Shk, shk. The sound of steel on stone filled the quiet air. "The Homestead Act of 1862, Silas said quietly. To claim a full section of acreage in that specific valley, the claimant must be the head of a family, a married man. My grandfather wrote the deed specifically under those terms to ensure I wouldn't die alone on this mountain. And the government doesn't want my gold, Abigail. The railroad men bought the land office in Cheyenne. They invoked a forgotten clause to force me out. Tomorrow at noon was the deadline to prove I had a family, or the deed defaulted to the territory, which means it defaults to the railroad. He paused, looking up at her. And do you know who owns the primary shares in the new railroad spur they want to build through my valley? Abigail's stomach dropped. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Ezekiel Cobb, Silas nodded grimly. Cobb isn't just a loan shark in Bitter Creek. He's the tip of the spear. He wants my land, and now I've just stolen the woman he considers his property. A profound sense of dread washed over Abigail. She thought she was escaping her nightmare, only to realize she had dragged Silas directly into the center of it. He won't just send Wyatt, Abigail whispered, her hands shaking so hard she spilled a few drops of coffee. If Cobb knows you're the one holding up his railroad, and you have me, he'll send everyone. He'll hire bounty hunters. Pinkertons. Silas slid the newly sharpened knife into its sheath with a soft click. He stood up, his massive frame silhouetted against the dark sky. Let them come, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying calm. I told you I'd kill the men hunting you. I am a man of my word. I know every rock, every shadow, and every canyon in this range. Cobb's men are going to learn a hard lesson. He walked over to his saddlebags, pulled out a heavy wool blanket, and tossed it to her. Get some sleep, Mrs. Hatcher. Tomorrow, we climb the Devil's Gate, and then we prepare for war. Abigail pulled the blanket tightly around herself, the reality of her new life setting in. She had married a mountain man to save her life, but as she stared up at the dark, looming peaks of the Wind River Range, she realized the battle for survival had only just begun. Dawn broke over the Wind River Range not with a gentle warmth, but with the cold, grey edge of a newly honed hatchet. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the wind off the glacial peaks carried a bite that stripped the heat from a body in seconds. Abigail woke to the smell of roasting chicory and pine smoke. She was wrapped in 3 heavy wool blankets, lying on a bed of fragrant spruce boughs. Every breath she took felt like a rusted knife twisting in her side. She groaned, clutching her ribs. Don't move, Silas's rough voice commanded from the other side of the fire. He walked over, carrying a battered tin cup and a strip of torn, white canvas. He knelt beside her, his massive frame blocking the biting wind. In the pale morning light, the jagged scar running through his eyebrow looked even more menacing. But his hands, huge and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he offered her the cup. Drink it all. It's willow bark tea, Silas instructed. Tastes like swamp water and dirt, but it'll dull the pain. I need to bind those ribs before we climb the gate. The trail gets worse from here. Abigail drank. It was incredibly bitter, but she forced it down, true to his word. Within 10 minutes, a strange, heavy numbness began to spread through her chest. Silas instructed her to sit up, keeping her modest but efficient as he wrapped the canvas tightly around her torso, pulling it taut to stabilize the fractured bones. My grandfather, Jedediah, taught me that, Silas muttered, tying off the canvas. He rode with Jim Bridger back in the 40s. Said a man who couldn't mend his own bones had no business in the high country. Thank you, Abigail whispered, catching her breath as the binding instantly provided relief. They mounted the horses as the first true rays of sun hit the peaks. The ascent to the Devil's Gate was a terrifying ordeal. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a goat path carved into the side of a sheer 1,000-foot drop. Below them, the river was just a silver thread roaring through the canyon. Silas rode Goliath in front, his eyes constantly scanning the shale for loose footing, while Abigail's roan mare followed blindly, trusting the larger horse. Abigail kept her eyes locked on the broad expanse of Silas's back. Wrapped in the buffalo coat she had insisted on returning to him, she dared not look down. Almost there, Silas called back over the howling wind. They rounded a massive boulder, and the narrow fissure of the Devil's Gate opened before them. It was a natural choke point, a crack in the granite wall barely wide enough for a wagon. As they passed through the shadows of the rock, the wind abruptly died. Abigail blinked as they emerged on the other side. Spread out before them, bathed in the crisp, golden light of morning, was a paradise hidden in the clouds. A massive, bowl-shaped valley stretched for miles, ringed by snow-capped peaks. A crystal-clear alpine lake mirrored the sky, surrounded by dense stands of blue spruce and golden aspen. In the center of a sprawling meadow, smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney of a sturdy, sprawling log cabin. 3,000 acres, Silas said, his voice dropping its hard edge, replaced by a deep, resonant reverence. From the timberline to the water's edge. This is what Cobb wants to tear apart. It's beautiful, Abigail breathed, momentarily forgetting the men hunting them, the debt, and the pain in her side. It's home, Silas corrected, and as of midnight last night, half of it belongs to you. They rode down into the valley. The cabin was a fortress built of massive, interlocking timber logs, chinked with mud and horsehair. Inside, it was warm and intensely practical. A massive stone hearth dominated the main room. There were shelves lined with canned goods, jars of preserves, boxes of Winchester ammunition, and a small library of leather-bound books that looked entirely out of place for a mountain trapper. Silas helped her off the horse and carried her saddlebags inside. Take the bed in the corner. Rest. I need to feed the horses and check the perimeter. Before he walked out the heavy oak door, he stopped and looked back at her. We made the deadline, Abigail. The surveyor in Cheyenne, a man named Thomas Donaldson, he works for the General Land Office. I sent a wire to him from Bitter Creek right before I walked into that saloon. The marriage is recorded. The deed is secure. The Union Pacific Railroad and Governor William Hale can go to hell. They can't take it legally now. But Cobb won't care about the law, Abigail said quietly, sitting on the edge of the feather bed. No, Silas agreed, his eyes darkening. He won't, which is why I need to go set the bear traps at the mouth of the gate. For the next 2 days, the mountain was eerily quiet. The willow bark tea and the tight binding worked miracles, allowing Abigail to move around the cabin with only a dull ache. She found herself falling into a strange domestic rhythm with the giant mountain man. Silas was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He chopped wood, hunted a mule deer to fill the smokehouse, and meticulously cleaned his vast array of firearms. He never pushed her for details about her past, and he treated her with a gruff, respectful distance. At night, he slept on a pallet of furs by the hearth, leaving the large feather bed entirely to her. It was on the third afternoon, while Silas was out checking his snares, that Abigail made the discovery. She was looking for a needle and thread to mend a tear in her skirt. She opened a heavy, iron-banded trunk at the foot of the bed, assuming it held extra linens. Instead, she found a false wooden bottom. When she pried it up, she found a stack of dusty, yellowed papers tied with a leather thong. Curiosity got the better of her. She untied the stack. They were ledgers and maps belonging to Jedediah Hatcher, dated 1868. But beneath them was a crisp, much newer document. It was a geological assay report from the Denver Mining Exchange, commissioned by Ezekiel Cobb only 3 months ago. Abigail's blood ran cold. She read the stamped ink over and over again. The report wasn't about the gradient of the land for a railroad spur. It detailed a massive, deep earth vein of pure copper and silver ore running directly beneath the Alpine Lake in the center of Silas's valley. Cobb didn't want the land to build a train track. He wanted to build an empire. The railroad story was just a front to get the federal government to invalidate Silas's deed, so Cobb's mining company could sweep in and claim the mineral rights. The heavy cabin door creaked open. Silas stepped in, bringing a gust of freezing wind and the smell of pine needles with him. He stopped, seeing her sitting on the floor with the papers in her lap. I was looking for a sewing kit, she said quickly, her voice trembling as she held up the assay report. Silas, did you know about this? He walked over slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He took the paper from her hand, his eyes scanning the Denver Mining Exchange seal. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently beneath his beard. No, he rumbled. My grandfather always told me the land was poor for farming, only good for trapping and timber. He said the earth here was sacred, not to be dug. Cobb knows, Abigail said, standing up, ignoring the twinge in her ribs. This was in the trunk. How did it get here? Silas looked at the paper, then toward the window facing the valley. The government surveyor. He came up here 2 weeks ago to serve me the eviction notice. He stayed the night. He must have left this behind by mistake, or hid it intending to come back. Silas, this changes everything, Abigail said, stepping closer to him. Ezekiel Cobb isn't going to send a few hired thugs from the saloon to clear you out. If there is a silver and copper lode worth millions beneath this lake, he will send an army. He will slaughter us both and burn this cabin to the ground. Silas looked down at her. She was no longer the terrified, bruised girl from the saloon. The mountain air had put color back in her cheeks, and her hazel eyes burned with a fierce, defiant intelligence. She had traded one death sentence for another, but she wasn't cowering. Slowly, Silas reached out. His large, rough thumb brushed gently over her cheek, just below the fading purple bruise Wyatt had given her. It was the first time he had touched her since the night he lifted her off the horse. They have to get through the Devil's Gate first, Silas said. his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I have enough black powder in the shed to bring the entire pass down on their heads. They want the silver? They can dig it out from under 10,000 tons of granite." He stepped away, walking to the gun rack on the wall. He took down a sleek, beautifully oiled Winchester lever-action rifle and walked back to her. He pressed it into her hands. It was heavy, the walnut stock cold and smooth. "Do you know how to shoot?" he asked. "My father taught me on a shotgun," she replied, gripping the weapon tightly. "I know how to point and pull." "A rifle requires more than pointing," Silas instructed. "It requires breathing. It requires knowing exactly when to squeeze." He looked her dead in the eye. "I am going to teach you, because tomorrow the war starts." The fourth morning dawned with an eerie, unnatural stillness. The birds weren't singing, and the elk had vanished from the meadow. Silas stood on the wide porch of the cabin, a brass spyglass pressed to his eye, scanning the jagged ridgeline above the Devil's Gate. Abigail stood beside him, a bandolier of 44 to 40 cartridges slung awkwardly over her shoulder, the Winchester clutched in her hands. "Do you see them?" she asked, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "Smoke," Silas muttered, lowering the glass. "About 5 miles down the trail. A dozen campfires at least." They pushed hard through the night and camped at the base of the ascent. "Is Wyatt leading them?" "Wyatt is a dog," Silas said with absolute disdain. "Cobb wouldn't trust a town dog with millions of dollars in silver. Look at the smoke, Abigail. It's thin, controlled. They aren't burning wet wood, and they aren't making a racket. They are professionals." Silas turned, walking back into the cabin. He began stuffing his pockets with spare ammunition and grabbing coils of fuse wire. Cobb hired outside guns, probably the Pinkerton National Detective Agency out of Denver, or hired regulators from the cattle wars. They know how to track, and they know how to kill. "What do we do?" Abigail asked, following him. "I go down to the gate. You stay here. If you hear an explosion, it means I brought the rocks down on the pass. If you hear rifle fire, it means they made it through." He stopped, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding her. "If they make it through the tree line, Abigail, you don't hesitate. You aim for the center of their chest, and you fire until the rifle is empty. Do you understand me? I won't let them take this place, Silas." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I know you won't, Mrs. Hatcher." Silas vanished into the dense pines, moving with a silent, terrifying grace that belied his massive size. Abigail was left alone in the sweeping valley. The silence was deafening. She barricaded the heavy oak door with an iron bar, propped the shutters open just enough to rest the barrel of her rifle, and waited. 2 hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows across the meadow. Then, she heard it, not une explosion. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, echoing through the mountains. Then another, and another. A rolling volley of gunfire shattered the peace of the valley. Abigail's heart hammered against her bound ribs. Silas hadn't blown the pass. They were through. Through the narrow slit in the shutters, she scanned the tree line. At first, she saw nothing. Then, movement. A man in a dark duster broke from the cover of the pines, sprinting toward a large boulder near the lake. Crack. The man jerked violently, his hat flying off, and he collapsed into the tall grass. A puff of white smoke drifted from a rocky outcropping high above the trail Silas's position. But Silas was only one man. Almost immediately, suppressing fire erupted from the woods, chewing up the rocks around Silas's position. Abigail counted the muzzle flashes. There were at least 15 men down there. Suddenly, a voice boomed across the valley, amplified by a tin megaphone. "Silas Hatcher, this is Amos Sterling, acting on behalf of the Denver Mining Exchange." The voice was refined, cold, and entirely out of place in the wilderness. "We have the perimeter surrounded. Ezekiel Cobb has purchased the outstanding debt on this property. You are trespassing. Throw down your weapons and send the girl out, and we will let you walk away into the high snows." Abigail felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. Amos Sterling. She had heard rumors of him in the Bitter Creek saloons. He was a ruthless manhunter, a former cavalry officer who specialized in breaking labor strikes and hunting down outlaws. "Go to hell, Sterling." Silas's roar echoed down from the rocks, followed instantly by a gunshot that shattered the megaphone in the Pinkertons' hands. The woods erupted in chaos. Men began pouring out of the tree line, fanning out, trying to flank Silas's elevated position. They were highly trained, moving in pairs, providing cover fire for one another. Silas was pinning them down, but he was vastly outnumbered, and they were slowly creeping up the ridge toward him. Abigail realized with sickening clarity that Silas couldn't hold them all. While the main force kept him occupied, a smaller detachment was going to slip past him and make a run for the cabin. She tightened her grip on the Winchester. She leveled the sights on the tall grass between the lake and her front porch. "Come on," she whispered to herself, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Come on." The grass parted. 3 men emerged, staying low, their rifles at the ready. Leading them was a man she recognized instantly. It was Wyatt, the town deputy, his face bruised and swollen from Silas's grip 3 nights prior, a look of pure, venomous anticipation in his eyes. He was pointing directly at the cabin. Abigail took a deep breath, let half of it out, aligned the iron sights with the center of Wyatt's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy walnut stock of the Winchester kicked hard against Abigail's bruised shoulder. The boom of the .44-40 cartridge in the enclosed space of the cabin was deafening, filling the room with the sharp, acidic stench of sulfur and burnt gunpowder. Through the narrow slit in the heavy oak shutters, she saw the immediate, violent result of her decision. Wyatt didn't even have time to register the muzzle flash. The heavy lead slug caught him high in the right shoulder, shattering his collarbone and spinning his broad frame around like a child's top. He let out a shriek that sounded less like a man and more like a slaughtered hog, dropping his revolver into the tall grass as he collapsed into the mud. The 2 regulators flanking him froze for a fraction of a second, stunned that the supposedly empty cabin had teeth. That hesitation was all Abigail needed. Silas's voice echoed in her mind. "Aim for the center and fire until it's empty." She worked the lever action, the brass casing ejecting with a sharp ping against the floorboards. She fired again. The man to Wyatt's left took a round to the thigh and went down hard, clutching his leg. The 3rd man finally raised his rifle, blindly firing a volley toward the cabin before diving behind the thick trunk of a blue spruce. Leads splintered the thick logs of the cabin's exterior. 1 bullet punched through the edge of the window shutter, showering Abigail with sharp wooden shrapnel. She ducked beneath the sill, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. High up on the ridge, the tempo of the battle abruptly changed. Amos Sterling, the Pinkerton commander who had learned his bloody trade serving under General George Crook during the Apache Wars, immediately recognized the sound of the Winchester. He blew a shrill, brass whistle, signaling his men. "The girl is in the cabin," Sterling's voice boomed over the gunfire. "Pin the mountain man down. Squad 2, take the house. Burn it if you have to." Silas, crouched behind a jagged spire of granite, realized his fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated Sterling's numbers. He watched in horror as 6 men broke away from the main skirmish line, sprinting through the dense timber toward the meadow. Silas didn't think. He reacted. He abandoned his covered position, exposing himself to the withering crossfire of a dozen Sharp's buffalo rifles. Bullets chipped the stone around him, spraying his face with granite dust. He unclipped a heavy canvas satchel from his belt, a relic from his grandfather's days, blasting tunnels for the early mining syndicates. Inside were 4 sticks of sweat-beaded dynamite, bound tightly together with twine and a short, fast-burning fuse. He struck a match against his boot, touched it to the fuse, and hurled the satchel with every ounce of his massive strength toward the natural overhang that formed the roof of the Devil's Gate. "Abigail, get down!" Silas roared, hoping his voice would carry over the valley. 3 seconds later, the mountain tore itself apart. The explosion was a concussive shockwave that physically punched the breath from the lungs of every man in the valley. A blinding flash of orange fire vaporized the granite overhang. Thousands of tons of ancient stone, shale, and dirt detached from the cliff face, cascading downward in a deafening apocalyptic roar. The landslide completely obliterated the narrow trail of the gate, burying 4 of Sterling's men instantly, and sealing the only entrance to the valley under a mountain of impassable rubble. The shockwave hit the cabin a moment later. The windows shattered, and a thick cloud of dust rolled over the meadow, plunging the afternoon into a choking, grey twilight. Abigail coughed, waving the dust from her eyes. She scrambled back to the window. The 6 men who had been charging the cabin were thrown to the ground by the tremor. Before they could stagger back to their feet, a massive, terrifying shadow burst from the tree line. It was Silas. He was out of rifle, ammunition. Having emptied his bandolier pinning down the main force, he descended upon the disoriented regulators, wielding only his grandfather's massive, bone-handled Bowie knife and the raw, terrifying momentum of a cornered grizzly. He hit the first man at a full sprint, driving the hilt of the blade into the man's temple. The second man raised a revolver, but Silas grabbed the barrel, snapping the man's wrist with a sickening crunch before delivering a devastating blow to his jaw. It was a brutal, intimate violence. Silas fought not with the refined tactics of the Pinkertons, but with the desperate, territorial savagery of the wild. Within 60 seconds, 3 men were dead, and the remaining 3 were scrambling backward in absolute terror, fleeing into the dense fog of the dust cloud. Silas didn't pursue. He sprinted for the cabin, vaulting onto the porch. Abigail opened the door. She threw the iron bar aside and hauled the heavy oak door open. Silas practically fell inside, slamming the door shut and barring it instantly. He leaned against the wood, his massive chest heaving, his face painted in grey dust and dark blood. A bullet had grazed his left bicep, tearing a deep, bloody furrow through the leather of his coat, and another had clipped his thigh. He looked at her. He saw the smoking Winchester in her hands and the grit in her hazel eyes. "I told you," Abigail breathed, her voice shaking but her posture unyielding. "I won't let them take this place." Silas slid down the door, letting out a breath that was half laugh, half groan. "You shoot straighter than most men I know, Mrs. Hatcher. But the war isn't over. Sterling is still out there, and he's trapped in this valley with us." Night fell over the Wind River Range like a heavy wool blanket, suffocating and completely devoid of stars. The dust from the landslide had settled, leaving an eerie, tension-filled silence in its wake. Inside the cabin, the hearth fire had been extinguished to prevent the smoke from giving away their exact position in the dark. The only light came from a single, heavily shielded oil lantern resting on the floor. Abigail knelt beside Silas. She had torn the clean, white cotton of her petticoat into strips. Using a basin of cold water and iodine from Silas's meager medical supplies, she was cleaning the gunshot wound on his thigh. "This is going to burn," she warned softly. "I've had worse from a badger," Silas grunted, his jaw clenched tight. As she poured the iodine, Silas's massive hand instinctively grabbed her shoulder. His grip was tight enough to bruise, but he didn't make a sound. Abigail worked quickly, binding the wound tightly to stop the bleeding. When she finished, she didn't pull away. She looked up at him in the dim, flickering light. His face was hard, etched with the violence of the day, but his icy blue eyes held a profound, unexpected vulnerability. "Why did you really do it?" Abigail asked, her voice a quiet whisper in the dark. "You had the gold. You could have walked into Cheyenne, bribed a judge, and fought Cobb in the courts. Marrying a stranger, taking on my debts, my enemies. It was madness." Silas looked down at her hands, still stained with his blood. "I went to Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. I met with Judge Joseph M. Carey, the federal magistrate. He laughed in my face. He told me the Union Pacific Railroad and the Denver Mining Exchange had already carved up my grandfather's land on a map. The law is a luxury for the rich, Abigail. Out here, the only law is blood and iron." He reached up, his rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I walked into that saloon looking for a business arrangement," Silas confessed, his voice dropping an octave. "But when you stepped up to me, when you looked me dead in the eye while a monster was hunting you, and you asked me to kill him, I didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor. I saw the only person in this godforsaken territory with enough fire in her soul to help me hold this mountain." Abigail's breath hitched. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a piece of property or a pawn in a rich man's game. She felt seen. "I'm not leaving, Silas," she said fiercely. Before Silas could answer, a voice echoed from the darkness outside, shattering the intimate moment. "Silas Hatcher, we have a proposition." It was Amos Sterling. But the voice that followed sent a spike of pure, unadulterated ice through Abigail's veins. "Listen to the man, Hatcher. I'm not a patient man, and it's freezing out here." Abigail froze. "Ezekiel Cobb," she whispered. Silas forced himself up, grabbing his Winchester and limping to the window. He peered through the splintered shutter. Down by the lake, 50 yards away, a dozen torches flared to life, illuminating the darkness. Ezekiel Cobb stood in the center. He was a wealthy, corpulent man draped in an expensive beaver pelt coat, smoking a thick cigar. Flanking him were Amos Sterling and a half-dozen heavily armed Pinkertons. But it was the man tied to a chair in front of Cobb that made Silas's blood run cold. It was Thomas Donaldson, the government surveyor. The man's face was badly beaten, his spectacles shattered. "You blew the pass, Hatcher," Cobb called out, his voice dripping with arrogant amusement. "Very dramatic. But my men found a goat trail up the western ridge. It took us 6 hours, but here we are. Now, I have Mr. Donaldson here. He is the only federal official who can verify that your marriage was logged before the noon deadline." Cobb pulled a rolled parchment from his coat. "Mr. Donaldson has agreed to sign a sworn affidavit stating that you held him at gunpoint, forced him to forge the date, and that your marriage to Abigail Preston is entirely fraudulent and legally void. The moment he signs this, the deed defaults. The land is mine. And you are just a squatter who murdered 3 of my men." Cobb took a long drag from his cigar. "Send the girl out. Throw down your guns. Do that, and I will let you walk away into the timber. You have my word. Refuse, and Sterling's men will burn that cabin to the ground with you both inside. You have 5 minutes." Silas stepped back from the window. The trap had closed. Cobb had circumvented the law entirely, using his wealth to rewrite reality. "He'll kill us anyway," Abigail said, her voice hollow. "If we surrender, he'll shoot you where you stand and drag me back to Bitter Creek." "I know," Silas said, leaning heavily against the wall. His mind raced. He had no dynamite left. He was low on ammunition. He was wounded, and there were at least 10 men out there with a hostage. "He wants the silver," Silas muttered, staring into the dark corner of the cabin. "He doesn't care about the timber, or the water, or the railroad. He wants the copper and silver vein beneath the lake." Silas turned to Abigail, his eyes blazing with a sudden, desperate realization. "My grandfather's journals. He wrote about the geography of this valley. The lake isn't fed by a river. It's fed by an underground glacial spring, and it sits entirely on a shelf of porous limestone directly above the cavern where the silver lode is buried." Abigail frowned, trying to follow his logic. "What does that mean?" "It means," Silas said, walking to the heavy iron trunk at the foot of the bed and throwing it open, "that the only thing keeping millions of gallons of water from drowning the silver vein forever is a natural rock dam at the far edge of the lake. If that dam breaks, the entire lake drains into the earth. The mine shaft will flood completely. It would take Cobb 10 years and $5 million in industrial pumps just to reach the mud, let alone the silver." Silas pulled out a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle from beneath the false bottom of the trunk. He unwrapped it to reveal a massive, brass-cased explosive, charge a military-grade sapper's bomb. "I held this back," Silas said, his voice grim. "If I blow the dam, the silver is gone forever. The land becomes completely worthless to the Denver Mining Exchange. Cobb's investors will ruin him, but Cobb and his men are standing right on the edge of the lake," Abigail realized, her eyes widening. "Exactly," Silas said. He checked the action on his Colt revolver. "I have to crawl through the drainage trench to plant the charge on the limestone face. I need you to stay here, open those shutters, and make enough noise to keep their eyes on the cabin. Can you do that?" Abigail picked up her Winchester. She looked at the bruised, battered giant who had risked everything for her. "I'll give them hell, Silas." The 5 minutes were up. "Time's up, Hatcher," Ezekiel Cobb roared from the shoreline. "Sterling, burn them out." Before the Pinkertons could light their fire arrows, the heavy oak door of the cabin kicked open. Abigail stood in the threshold, perfectly silhouetted by a sudden flare of the lantern she had kicked over behind her. She didn't say a word. She raised the Winchester and opened fire. Her first shot shattered the lantern in Amos Sterling's hand, plunging the Pinkerton commander into darkness. Her second shot tore through the beaver pelt coat of Ezekiel Cobb, missing his flesh by inches but sending the corpulent man diving into the mud, screaming in terror. The regulators erupted in a frenzy of return fire. Bullets chewed the doorframe to splinters. Abigail threw herself onto the floorboards, crawling behind the thick stone of the hearth as lead rained through the cabin. She reloaded in the dark, popping up at a shattered window to fire 2 more rounds, constantly shifting her position to make them think there were multiple shooters. "She's alone," Sterling yelled, realizing the pattern. "Where is the mountain man? Watch the flanks." While Abigail drew their fury, Silas was moving like a phantom through the freezing, knee-deep mud of the drainage trench that ran parallel to the lake. The icy water numbed his wounded leg, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He reached the limestone outcropping, a massive, fragile shelf of rock, holding back the crushing weight of the alpine lake. He wedged the brass sapper's charge deep into a natural fissure in the stone. He didn't have a long fuse. He had a friction pull cord, designed for immediate detonation. He had to be clear, or the blast would tear him apart. Silas gripped the cord, braced his boots against the mud, and prepared to pull. Suddenly, a heavy boot slammed down onto his wounded thigh. Silas roared in agony, his grip slipping from the cord. He looked up. Amos Sterling stood above him on the edge of the trench, a silver-plated revolver aimed directly at Silas's forehead. The Pinkerton had tracked his blood trail through the mud. "You're a hard man to kill, Hatcher," Sterling said coldly, cocking the hammer of the revolver. "But I realized you weren't shooting from the cabin. What are you doing down here in the mud?" Sterling's eyes shifted from Silas to the brass charge wedged in the rocks, and then to the vast expanse of the lake above them. The Pinkerton's eyes went wide as the horrific realization dawned on him. "You're going to drown the vein," Sterling whispered. "No," Silas growled, his hand inching back toward the pull cord. "I'm going to drown you." Before Sterling could pull the trigger, a single, deafening gunshot echoed from the porch of the cabin. Sterling stiffened. He looked down at his chest, a look of profound confusion crossing his face as a dark stain spread across his duster. He dropped his revolver, swaying for a moment before collapsing backward into the dark water of the lake. 100 yards away, Abigail lowered the smoking Winchester, her hands shaking violently. It was a 1 in a million shot, fired in the dark, fueled by pure desperation. Silas didn't waste the miracle she had given him. He grabbed the pull cord, yanked it with all his might, and dove backward into the deep mud of the trench. Boom! The explosion was fundamentally different from the landslide at the gate. This wasn't a crack. It was a deep, subterranean roar that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. The brass charge shattered the structural integrity of the limestone shelf. For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the earth groaned. With a sound like a tearing sky, the entire western edge of the lake simply collapsed downward. Millions of gallons of freezing, black water surged forward, creating an instant, devastating flash flood. Ezekiel Cobb, scrambling to his feet near the shoreline, turned just in time to see a 20-foot wall of water, mud, and jagged limestone bearing down on him. His scream was instantly silenced as the torrent swallowed him, his corrupt magistrate, and the remaining Pinkertons whole. The flood swept them over the edge of the plateau, washing them down the treacherous, rocky descent of the mountain like broken twigs. Silas, clinging desperately to the deep roots of an ancient pine tree at the bottom of the trench, held his breath as the floodwaters roared mere feet above his head, violently draining the lake into the gaping maw of the exposed silver cavern. The earth shook for 10 full minutes as the cavern filled, the water crushing the timber supports Cobb's men had secretly built, burying the silver and copper forever under tons of impenetrable mud and glacial water. When the roaring finally stopped, replaced by the gurgling sound of settling mud, Silas slowly pulled himself out of the trench. He was soaked, freezing, and bleeding, but alive. He limped toward the cabin. The porch was shredded, the door hung on one hinge, and smoke drifted from the roof. Abigail stepped out from the ruins. She was covered in wood dust, her dress torn, the Winchester hanging loosely by her side. She looked at the drained basin of the lake, then at Silas. He walked up the steps, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and pulled her into his chest. Abigail dropped the rifle, burying her face in his thick, ruined coat, her arms wrapping tightly around him. They stood there in the freezing night, 2 battered survivors clinging to each other amidst the wreckage of a billionaire's greed. The Wind River Range keeps its secrets, burying the sins of men beneath winter snows and granite slides. Ezekiel Cobb was never seen again, his body washed down into the unforgiving canyons, his empire collapsing into bankruptcy the moment the Denver Mining Exchange realized the silver was entombed forever beneath an undrainable subterranean sea. The railroad spurred south, leaving the high country to the wolves, the hawks, and the ghosts. But the valley did not remain empty. In the years that followed, the splintered cabin was rebuilt, stronger and larger than before. Silas and Abigail Hatcher forged a life from the harsh, beautiful wilderness, bound not by a desperate bargain struck in a smoky saloon, but by the unbreakable iron of shared survival. The mountain man had bought a wife to save his land, but in the end, it was the fragile, fearless woman who had truly saved him.